It began on a Tuesday, in a room that smelled of dust and high-priced regret. The chair was deep, the leather cracked and cold, and it felt like it was trying to consume me. I sat there with my 3-year-old son, Leo, sleeping against my chest. When your life is a constant war just to keep the lights on, inheritance sounds like a rescue. But when you've been abandoned by the people who should have stayed, you learn to suspect a miracle. I was about to be handed a cruel joke. I was about to face a choice that would rewrite my future. I think you understand. It began on a Tuesday, in a room that smelled of old paper and expensive disappointment. The leather was deep, mapped with cracks, and it seemed to want to swallow me whole. Across the wide expanse of a mahogany desk, Mr. Davies adjusted his frames. He was a man made of sharp lines and muted grey colours. From his stiff suit to the perfect part in his hair, he looked like a statue. He stared at the folder, then at me, then back at the file. It was like he was staring at an equation that wouldn't balance. "To be clear, Miss Vance," he said. His voice was as dry as dead leaves. "Your grandmother, Eleanor Vance, has left you her entire estate." I didn't speak. I just nodded. My son Leo was a warm weight in my lap. His soft breathing was the only anchor I had in that sterile room. I'd had to pull him from a daycare I could barely afford for this. The letter had made it sound life-changing. The word __quote_3__ had lived in my head for a week. It was a shimmering mirage of safety. Estates meant money. They meant not choosing between the electric bill and new shoes for a growing boy. He cleared his throat. Quote 4. He pushed a thick piece of cardstock across the wood. It looked ancient. I didn't touch it. Coldwater County. I only knew that name from my mother's stories. She whispered it with a mix of poison and longing. It was a place hours away, a place where my grandmother had hidden herself, a place where we were never welcome. __quote_5__. Mr. Davies continued. I saw something in his eyes. Maybe it was pity. He opened a small beige envelope and tipped the contents onto the desk. 2 $1 bills. They lay there, limp and pathetic, under the bright lights. I just stared. $2. Leo stirred, pointing a small finger. __quote_6___. I laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a short, sharp burst of air, the sound of a dream dying. The mirage vanished. I was back in the gritty reality of my own life. I was ready to leave, but the lawyer held up one last page. $2, I said. The words tasted like iron. Mr. Davies gave me a tight smile. It is often a legal formality, a token to make the will valid. A token of what? A lifetime of silence? My mother's letters that went unread, a granddaughter she never met. It felt like a final, calculated insult. He saw my face, and his professional mask finally cracked. Quote 9. Quote, he said, using my name for the first time. Quote 10. Quote. Davies slid a high-gloss sheet across the mahogany. The header read, Ridgeback Development Group. They had been circling my grandmother for years like wolves. Eleanor Vance never flinched. Now, with her gone, they had scented blood and doubled down. I looked at the number. $75,000. My bank account was a graveyard of, quote 11, notices. To me, it might as well have been 75 million. It was not just money, it was an escape hatch. Quote 12. Davies said. His voice was too smooth, too practiced. He told me it was just brush and timber bordering a state forest, luxury cabins for people who did not know what real work felt like. The house was a wreck. The taxes were 2 years behind. He called it a liability. He told me selling was the only smart move left on the board. A clean break. A fresh start. A fresh start. I whispered those words to the steam of the coffee machine at the diner every morning. I prayed for them while Leo slept in our cramped, one-bedroom cage. Responsibility is a weight that never stops pressing. And here it was, salvation printed on corporate stationery. Just a signature, and I could walk away from a place I had never seen. I would be giving away the only thing left by a woman I never knew. But I have learned one thing in this life. If it feels easy, someone is hiding the cost. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 13, underscore, 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 I asked. The words caught in my throat. Davies blinked, his professional mask slipping for a second. He started talking about immediate tax liens and county auctions. He told me the house had been rotting while my grandmother was in the nursing home. He called her stubborn. My mother used to say the same thing. She said Eleanor would rather freeze to death than ask for a hand up. I looked at the $2 in my hand. Then I looked at the deed. 144 Sparrow Creek Lane. It sounded like a ghost story. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 14, underscore, 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 I said. I shoved the 2 crumpled bills into my pocket. They felt like a joke. Leo was starting to squirm, his patience as thin as my bank balance. The meeting was done. The dream was dead. It was replaced by a choice I was not ready to carry. Davies stood up, checking his watch. Quote, 15, quote, he warned. Quote, 16, quote. He handed me his card and the heavy weight of the deed. His hand was dry as old parchment. I walked out of that chilled, silent tomb and back into the sweltering, loud city. The paper in my hand felt like lead. It was an anchor, dragging me toward a story I had not even begun to read. $75,000 was the exact price of a new life. It was the ladder that could finally pull Leo and me out of the deep end and onto solid ground. Yet, somewhere in the hollow of my chest, a quiet, stubborn resistance started to ache. I looked at the only photograph I possessed of Eleanor Vance. My grandmother didn't look cruel in the faded frame. She looked fierce. She stood there like she was guarding something precious, and I wondered if I was finally the one meant to find it. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford that night. Leo was a warm, heavy weight of perfect trust beside me, his small hand curled around my thumb. Outside, the apartment was silent, save for the hum of the old refrigerator and the distant, lonely wail of a siren. That was the city's only lullaby. Since I aged out of the state's care and brought Leo into the world, my life has been nothing but math, cold, hard arithmetic. I weighed the cost of daycare against the hours I could stand on my feet. I measured the price of bread against the gas in the tank. Every single dollar I earned had a job. Most had 2. I lived in a fortress of pragmatism I had built brick by brick out of sheer necessity. There was no room for sentimentality, no room for underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 17, underscore, underscore. I stood up and walked to the cramped kitchenette. There, resting next to a pile of past due bills, was the deed. 144 Sparrow Creek Lane. I picked it up. The paper felt thick and heavy, the ornate lettering pressing into my skin. Going there would cost me every cent of my savings. It didn't look like a legal document. It felt like an invitation. Mr. Davis's advice echoed in my ears. He called the property a liability, not an asset. He told me the smart move was a clean break. He was a professional, and he was right. He saw a collapsing house and back taxes. He saw $75,000 as the only logical solution. I tried to picture that money. I could see a down payment on a condo in a neighborhood where the sirens didn't scream. I could see a reliable car. I could see a future for Leo. For the first time in my adult life, I wouldn't be drowning. All I had to do was walk away from a patch of dirt I'd never seen. A ruin left to me by a ghost. It was the only choice that made sense. But my mother's voice wouldn't let me be. She rarely spoke of Eleanor Vance, and when she did, her words were a jagged mess of old wounds. She chose that place over me, my mother had whispered once, her voice thick with exhaustion. That dirt and those trees mattered more than her own daughter. My mother died when I was 16. A sudden illness took her before I could ask the questions that were burning in me now. She left me with a box of pictures, a terror of being alone, and a broken story about the woman who had abandoned her. I wondered if this house was just the final piece of that abandonment, or if it was something else entirely. I looked at the photo of Eleanor in my wallet. She was probably my age then, standing before a half-finished porch. Her hair was wild, and her face was stained with grit. But her eyes were clear. They were focused. She was staring at the camera like it was a challenger she intended to beat. That wasn't the look of a woman who didn't care. That was the look of a fighter. I traced the raised ink on the deed with my thumb. What was I fighting for? A better shift at the diner? A landlord who might finally fix the leak in the ceiling? My dreams had become so small. They had become so immediate. Maybe this was more than just a way to stop drowning. Maybe it was a chance to finally own a piece of the sky. The feeling wasn't a choice anymore. It was a current, pulling me towards something I couldn't name. I wasn't signing that paper. Not until I stood on that ground myself. I had to put my feet on the same dirt my grandmother chose over everything else. I had to see the house she built with her own hands, and then watched crumble. I had to find out if the story my mother told was the only version of the truth. The next morning I called the diner. Family emergency, I said. It was a lie, but as the words left my mouth, they felt like the first honest thing I'd said in a decade. I took the last of my savings, every hard-earned cent, and bought 2 tickets to Pine Ridge. It was the closest the bus could get us to Coldwater County. I packed a single bag, a few clothes for me, toys for Leo, that one faded photograph I keep in my wallet. At the very bottom, I tucked the deed. It felt like planting a seed in the dark. I didn't know what would grow, but for the first time in years, the fear was gone. In its place was a tiny, sharp sliver of hope. The bus ride felt like traveling between 2 different lives. We left the city under a suffocating blanket of grey smog, the buildings crowded together like they were fighting for air. Leo is usually loud, full of energy, but he sat perfectly still. His nose was pressed flat against the glass. For hours the world was nothing but concrete, strip malls, and highways choked with frustrated drivers. Then, slowly, the city began to lose its grip. The buildings drifted apart. Patches of green broke through the grey. The sky widened until it was a brilliant, stinging blue. Leo eventually fell asleep, his head heavy on my lap as we crossed into the high country. The landscape opened up into rolling hills and forests of oak and pine, so thick they looked like a wall. Even the air coming through the vents changed. It smelled clean. It tasted of damp earth and pine needles. We were the only souls to step off the bus in Pine Ridge. The station was nothing more than a weathered bench outside a general store that looked frozen in 1975. The bus pulled away with a long, mechanical sigh, leaving us in a silence so deep it was unnerving. I was used to the city, the sirens, the shouting, the constant hum of life. Here, the quiet felt like a physical presence watching us. There was a sign in the store window for a taxi. I called the number. A man named Earl answered. His voice was gravelly but patient. He told me he'd be there in 10 minutes. While we waited, I bought a juice for Leo and a coffee for myself. The woman behind the counter had eyes that had seen a lot of winters. A web of deep wrinkles framed her face. She didn't even have to ask. Quote, 20, quote, she said. It was a statement of fact. Quote, 21, quote, I told her. Quote, 22, quote. Her expression shifted instantly. It wasn't just curiosity. It was a look of genuine pity. The old Vance place, she whispered, her voice dropping as if she were sharing a secret. Nobody's been out that way in a long time. Not since they took Eleanor. The way she said it, they took Eleanor. It didn't sound like a nursing home. It sounded like an abduction. Like the house itself had lost its soul. Quote 25, I said. The woman froze. She looked at me, then down at Leo, who was currently trying to scale a mountain of canned beans. Quote 26, she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. Quote 27. Just then, Earl's taxi pulled up. It was a massive, boat-like sedan that smelled of old gasoline and wintergreen. The driver was a mountain of a man with a face buried under a dense beard. He didn't offer a greeting, just a low grunt before tossing my battered suitcase into the back. As the tires hummed against the pavement, the silence between us grew heavy. Eventually, he seemed to feel the weight of it. He caught my eye in the stained rearview mirror. "Heading up to the old Vance property," he noted. "You kin?" "I'm her granddaughter," I told him. He gave a slow, knowing nod. "Eleanor. She was a hard woman to break." I looked out at the passing trees. "She kept to herself," I said. Earl adjusted his grip on the wheel. "People in these parts talked, claimed she'd lost her mind. Some said she was guarding a secret she couldn't afford to share." "Was she?" I asked. His massive shoulders shifted in a shrug. "Couldn't tell you. But she clung to that dirt like it was her own skin. Fought for it too." He spat a bit of tobacco. "The Ridgeback Development Group hounded her for a decade. Sent some suit from the city to wave a check in her face. She told him she'd put a match to the rafters before she'd let them touch a single acre." The asphalt gave way to a gravel path that felt more like a memory than a road. Pine branches clawed at the windows as the forest closed in, ancient and suffocating. Earl hit the brakes where the ruts became too deep for the tires. "End of the line," he muttered. "You've got a quarter-mile of walking left. Are you certain about this? There's nothing but ghosts up that hill." "I'm sure," I replied, counting out my last few bills. He lingered as he handed back the change, his eyes softening when they landed on Leo. "If you need a way out, you call. But listen, don't stay here after the sun goes down. It isn't safe." He didn't explain the warning, and I didn't want to hear it. After he managed a slow, grinding U-turn, the taillights vanished into the dust. The silence returned, humming with the weight of the woods. I gripped Leo's small hand in my left and the handle of our life's remains in my right. We moved forward. The air tasted of cold sap and ancient needles. Light broke through the leaves in jagged, flickering shards, dappling the path. It was striking, but the beauty felt sharp. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes hidden in the brush. Then, the trees finally surrendered to a clearing. I stopped. Mr. Davies had called the place neglected. He was wrong. The house looked wounded. It was a modest salt box, its blue paint hanging in ragged strips like dead skin. The porch listed heavily to the left. One window was blinded by plywood. Weeds were swallowing the foundations whole. Yet, it stood its ground. It wasn't a ruin. It was a sentry. Leo let out a soft gasp of wonder. He wasn't seeing the decay, he was looking past it. I, however, was anchored to the rotting wood we were meant to call a home. Behind the house, the ridge dropped away into a staggering void. A silver vein of water cut through the valley floor miles below. The mountains beyond were bruised purple and blue against the horizon. It was a masterpiece of isolation. I approached the entrance, my pulse drumming against my ribs. I pulled the iron key from the envelope. It was cold and carried the weight of a different era. When I forced it into the lock, the metal gave a jagged, rusty scream. I leaned my shoulder into the wood, and the door yielded. The darkness inside was absolute and still. A breath of stale, musty air hit me, smelling of wood smoke, dust, and decades of silence. I took one last breath of the outside world, stepped over the threshold, and let the door close behind us. The interior was a perfect, frozen capsule of the past. Time had settled here in a thick, choking coat of grey. Every surface was buried under it. In the center of the house, a stone fireplace sat hollow and forgotten. Its hearth was cold. The fire had gone out a long time ago. White sheets clung to the sofa and armchairs like the shrouds of sleeping ghosts. Beneath the fabric, the old floral patterns were bleeding away into nothing. Thick columns of sunlight cut through the filth on the windows. They turned the floating dust into dancing gold. The air didn't feel heavy with fear, only a profound, quiet sadness. It felt like the house had been holding its breath for decades. Now, it was finally letting it go. Leo whispered, his small nose wrinkling in distaste. I dropped our bags on the floor and squeezed his hand. We drifted through the rooms like shadows. The kitchen was a cramped space with a stained porcelain sink and a stove from another era. A single chipped mug sat alone on the counter. It looked like it was still waiting for a morning coffee that never arrived. I led Leo up the narrow stairs to the 2 bedrooms. One room was hollow, containing nothing but a stripped bed frame. The other was clearly hers. A handmade quilt lay folded at the foot of an iron bed. Its colours were still sharp and defiant against the grey. Beneath the window sat a small desk. Above it, a calendar remained frozen on a page from more than a year ago. Her ghost lived in the corners of this room. This was where she dreamed. This was where she watched the world change outside that window. My fingers traced the edges of the quilt. Each stitch was tight and flawless. My mother used to say she was a master with a needle. It was one of the only kind things she ever said about her. A small stack of books waited on the desk. Poetry, a guide for identifying local birds, a tattered copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. None of them held the answers I needed. That old, familiar ache of disappointment flared up in my chest. I don't know what I was looking for. A confession? A map to her secrets? I felt like a fool for chasing shadows. My foot caught on something hard tucked under the bed. I hesitated. Mr. Davies had warned me this place was a wreck, a black hole for money. The rational choice was to call Earl, drive back to the city, and tell the lawyer I'd take the money. $75,000. It was a fortune to someone like me. It was the sound of safety. I started to turn away, but a shape in the shadows stopped me. Something was buried deep under the frame. I dropped to my knees, feeling the joints crack, and reached into the dark. My skin grazed cold, cracked leather. I hauled it out into the light. It was a massive steamer trunk. It was wrapped in thick straps and heavy brass fittings. It felt solid, real. 2 letters were stamped into the leather, faded but unmistakable. E.V. Eleanor Vance. My pulse began to hammer against my ribs. This was the heart of the mystery. If she left anything for me, it was inside this box. But the clasps were held tight by a heavy brass lock. There was no sign of a key. Anger flared in my gut. I had come too far to be stopped by a piece of metal. I scanned the room, my mind racing, then remembered the tools downstairs. I fetched the iron poker. It felt cold and heavy in my grip. I stood over the trunk, feeling like a thief, like I was violating her final bit of privacy. But I couldn't stop now. I jammed the iron tip into the lock and shoved. The metal shrieked. I threw my entire weight against it, jaw clenched. Then, with a sickening, violent snap, the lock gave way. The padlock hit the floorboards with a heavy, hollow thud. I froze. The silence that followed felt like a physical weight against my chest. I gripped the edge of the lid and pulled. It gave way with a slow, agonizing groan, releasing a scent that had been trapped for decades. But the air that escaped wasn't the smell of rot. It was the sharp, clean bite of cedar and aged parchment. My fingers shook as the shadows inside retreated. I expected moth-eaten clothes or forgotten trinkets. Instead, I saw paper, stacks and stacks of it, bound tightly with yellowed twine. Ledgers, envelopes, folders. This wasn't a chest of family secrets. It was a mobile filing cabinet. It wasn't about the heart. It was about the work. Disappointment and curiosity fought for space in my gut. I pulled out the first bundle. Decades of bank statements stared back at me. A life measured in ink and columns of math. Below that lay the receipts. Lumber, roofing nails, bags of heavy cement, a new well pump. Every single one was marked, paid in cash. People said Eleanor Vance let this place fall apart. These papers said they were wrong. She hadn't neglected this house. She had built it with her own 2 hands and fought for every shingle. Then, resting on a thick manila folder, I saw the envelope. It was long and pale. On the front, a single word was written in a delicate, spidery script. Ara. My pulse hammered against my ribs. I couldn't breathe. This was the voice I'd spent a lifetime waiting to hear. I sank onto the floorboards. Leo was nearby, preoccupied with the dust motes dancing in the light. I broke the wax seal with shaking fingers. The paper was thin, almost translucent. It was dated just 7 days before they took her to the nursing home. She knew the end was coming. "My dearest," the letter began. I couldn't see the rest. My eyes flooded with heat. In 30 years, no one had ever called me that. Quote 46, quote, the letter said, quote 47, quote. I had to stop. I pressed the heels of my palms into my sockets. Home. She called this wreckage a home. She wrote that this place had been waiting for me since before my first breath. I knew the rumors. I knew the lies I'd grown up with. She knew my mother felt abandoned. She admitted it was true, in a way. But she begged me to listen. Every cold silence and every ignored letter had been a shield. It was the only way to save this land for me. I kept reading as the world shifted under my feet. She finally spoke his name. My grandfather. Marcus. He was handsome, charming, and owned by men you don't say no to. To Marcus, these acres weren't a legacy. They were collateral for his gambling debts. He tried to mortgage the property and give it away to settle his losses. Eleanor had to get my mother to safety. She sent her to the city under the guise of needing space. It was a cruel lie, but a necessary one. She had to break his hold. She divorced him to secure the deed, but legal papers don't stop desperate men. They were coming for the land anyway. So she made a brutal, calculated decision. She severed every tie. She weaponized the rumors, allowing the whispers of her madness and hostility to become a wall around this place. She transformed herself into a pariah. She let the house rot and the taxes pile up, knowing the county would be slow to move and developers would see only a liability. It was a 30-year performance of poverty, a mask worn to protect this single patch of earth. "It broke my heart to push your mother away," the letter whispered from the page. The ink was blurred there, smudged by a decades-old tear. She let her daughter believe she was unloved. She gave her up to save her. She became a monster to guard an inheritance for a grandchild she would never meet. It wasn't an inheritance of silver or gold. It was the gift of a place to stand where no one could ever tell me to leave. I was breaking now, the air leaving me in jagged, silent gasps. Leo felt the tremor in my chest and crawled into my lap, his small arms anchoring me to the present. I held him until the paper crinkled between us. This wasn't abandonment, it was a 30-year siege. Eleanor Vance had spent her entire life holding this ground against the world, alone. The stories, the decay, the $2 price tag, it was all camouflage. She made herself small so that this land could eventually be enough for me. For my entire life, I carried the weight of being unwanted. I was the girl left by a father I never knew, a mother lost too early, and a grandmother who was a cold mystery. I thought I was the product of a broken line, but this letter changed the ink of my history. I wasn't the last link in a chain of failures. I was the reason she kept the chain from snapping. The grief was a physical weight. I mourned for my grandmother's hollow, lonely life. I mourned for my mother, who died believing her own mother didn't want her. All those years were sacrificed to a misunderstanding that was actually a shield. I wept for every one of them. I cried until my head throbbed and I was empty. The sun began its descent over Pine Ridge, stretching long, tired shadows across the floorboards. The golden light filling the room felt soft, almost like an apology. Eventually, a cold calm settled over me. The sorrow remained, but it was joined by a sudden, sharp pride. I came from a line of people who knew how to endure. My grandmother fought for this dirt. My mother fought to raise me with nothing. Now it was my turn to stand, but I didn't even know what the enemy looked like yet. Then the phone in my pocket buzzed. I shouldn't have had a signal this far out in Coldwater County, but the screen stayed lit with an unknown number. I hesitated, then pressed the phone to my ear. "Hello, Alara. It's David Davis." His voice sounded thin, like it was traveling through a long tunnel. "I'm glad you picked up. I wasn't sure you'd have reception at the house." "What is it, Mr. Davis?" I asked. My voice was a raw, hoarse rasp. "I have news. I just got off the line with the legal department at Ridgeback Development Group. They know you're on site. They've authorized me to give you a final number." I held my breath, the silence of the woods pressing against the windows. "They are offering you $250,000. The number hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. $250,000. It was an impossible, life-altering sum. It was a total escape from the life I had known. No more shifts at the diner, no more worrying about the rent. It was a secure, bright future for Leo, handed to me on a platter. "They need an answer by tomorrow morning," Mr. Davies urged. "This is a one-time offer, Ara. Take it or leave it. As your lawyer, I'm telling you to sign. This is a lottery ticket. You'd be insane to walk away from this." Insane. That was the word my grandmother wore like a suit of armor. I looked around the skeletal room as the light began to fail. My eyes drifted to the open trunk, a vessel for her entire life's work. I felt her letter trembling in my hand. For 30 years she lived here in total isolation. She fought the world from this porch. She didn't do it for a $250,000 payout. She did it for this soil. She did it for this specific silence. She did it for this wounded, beautiful, stubborn house. Eleanor Vance hadn't just left me a property. He offered me a choice of identities. Was I the woman who took the easy money and ran? Or was I truly my grandmother's granddaughter? This is the moment where the fog clears. Have you ever faced a crossroads like that? A second where two paths diverge so sharply you can feel your future shifting. It is terrifying. It is also the only time you will ever feel truly alive. If you are standing in this dusty room with me, thank you. It means you understand that some things are too deep for a price tag. If these stories of hidden strength and impossible choices speak to you, I hope you'll subscribe to the channel. We are building a community of people who understand the weight of a struggle. I read every single comment. Your stories matter too. Now, let's get back to that phone call. The silence on the line felt heavy. I could hear Mr. Davies breathing on the other end, waiting for my surrender. To him, there was only one logical move. Maybe for the person I was yesterday, he was right. But yesterday's version of me didn't know who she was. Today, the truth was surfacing. I took a deep breath. The scent of cedar and old paper filled my lungs. It smelled like iron. It smelled like home. But something felt unfinished. Eleanor was practical. She was a warrior, but she was no fool. A moral victory is a cold comfort in a house with no heat. I reached back into the trunk. My fingers brushed against a small fabric loop sewn into the cedar. I hadn't seen it before. My hands shook as I pulled. The false bottom gave way with a soft groan of wood. My breath caught in my throat. It was cash. Stacks of it, bound in faded paper strips. 10s, 20s, 50s. It was old currency, soft and warm thin from touch. It wasn't a lottery jackpot, but it was significant. It was far more than the $2 she left on the lawyer's desk. Tucked beside the bills was a small velvet pouch. Inside sat the key to the trunk and one final note. "This is your start," the ink read. "Not an escape, but a foundation. The land is your inheritance. This is your toolbox. Use it to build. Do not use it to run. The choice is still yours. It always will be. But know that you are not starting from nothing. You are starting from a place of love." That was the final piece of the puzzle. She hadn't trapped me with a burden. She had given me a real chance. The developer's money was a ticket to keep hiding. This money, saved penny by penny over decades, was an investment. It was a stake in a new life. It was the difference between being bought and being empowered. "Elara, are you there?" Mr. Davies' voice crackled through the speaker, sharp and impatient. "I'm here," I said. My voice didn't shake. It was the steadiest thing about me. Mr. Davis didn't even wait for a breath. He started talking about the draft, the legal sequence, and how quickly he could get the Ridgeback Development Group paperwork in front of me. He was already moving on to the next file on his desk. He expected a yes. People like him always expect people like me to take the money and run. "Quote, 60 quote," I said. That one word hit the air like a lead weight. It was the strongest thing I had ever uttered. It felt like dropping a stone into a well so deep you never hear it hit the bottom. Mr. Davies actually sputtered. "Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 61, underscore, underscore," he asked. His logic was failing him. I let a smile reach my face, a real one. I told him to inform Ridgeback Development that their offer was dead. I wasn't selling. There was nothing but the sound of static on the line for a long, heavy minute. I could see him in my mind. He was sitting in some climate-controlled office, surrounded by glass and cold ledgers, staring at a world that no longer made sense. He had accounted for the back taxes. He had factored in the rot in the wood and the holes in the roof, but he hadn't calculated the value of Eleanor Vance's love. He hadn't put a price on her sacrifice. He went completely silent. It wasn't just a pause. It was the silence of a man realizing his spreadsheets were useless. He dealt in assets and liabilities, in things that could be bought and buried. I had just made a choice that didn't have a column. When he finally found his voice, the professional armor was gone. "Elara, are you certain?" he asked. $250,000. I looked down at Leo. He was fast asleep in my lap, his small hand curled against my knee. I told Mr. Davies I was certain. 144 Sparrow Creek Lane was staying with the Vances. He started to argue. He mentioned the repairs, the crushing debt, the impossibility of the task. "I'll manage," I told him. "My grandmother left me everything I need." I didn't tell him about the money in the trunk. That was my secret. That was my foundation. There was one more pause. Then he said something I never saw coming. "Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 66, underscore, underscore," he whispered. It was quiet, almost a confession. Then the line went dead. I sat there in the fading twilight as the shadows stretched across the floor. The weight of the world didn't vanish, it just changed. I wasn't being pushed down anymore. I was finally standing up. This wasn't the end of the struggle. It was just the birth of a harder one. The roof was a disaster. The taxes were a mountain. I had a 3-year-old boy to raise in a house with no water and wires that hissed behind the walls. It was going to be punishing. But for the first time in my life, the hardship belonged to me. It was a mountain I had chosen to climb, not one I had been shoved off of. The next morning, the world sounded different. It was a riot of birdsong, a loud, joyful noise I'd never heard in the city. The sun hit the dirty windows in soft, pale streaks. Leo and I were still on the floor, tangled in old sheets from the furniture. For a second, the panic flared up. I looked at the peeling wallpaper and thought, what have I done? The scale of it was terrifying. But then I looked out at the valley. The mist was clinging to the trees in Sparrow Creek, and the fear just settled. I found the old iron pump in the yard. The handle was rusted shut, frozen by years of neglect. I put my whole body into it, grunting as the metal bit into my palms. I threw my weight down again and again until the pump groaned. A thick, red sludge sputtered out first. I kept going. I didn't stop until the water ran clear. It was cold, clean, and honest. It felt like my first real victory. I spent the rest of the morning walking the land. The land was bigger than the paperwork suggested. 5 acres of tangled wildflowers sloping down toward a creek that never stopped talking. Sparrow Creek. It was finally real. I saw an old collapsed barn with silvered timbers, A graveyard of weeds marked what used to be a vegetable garden. My grandmother hadn't just left me a house, she'd left me a homestead. I thought about the cash in that trunk. It was more than I'd ever touched, but I knew it was a disappearing act waiting to happen. This wasn't never work again money. It was patch the roof and buy a truck money. It was the price of keeping the lights on. A toolbox, just like she said. I called Earl, the driver. He sounded like he'd already written me off. Thought you'd be long gone by now, he grunted. I told him I needed a ride. And I needed a roofer who didn't cut corners. There was a long pause on the line. Quote 70, quote 71, I told him. I could almost feel his smile through the phone. He said I had Eleanor's steel in my spine. He'd be there in an hour. That afternoon in Pine Ridge, I walked into the tax office. The room smelled like stale coffee and industrial cleaner. I laid down the cash for 2 years of back taxes. The clerk didn't ask a single question. She just brought that heavy stamp down with a thud that echoed in my chest. "Welcome back, Ms. Vance," she said. It didn't feel like a greeting. It felt like a confirmation. Next, I hit the library. I used their computer to search for grants. Historic homestead restoration, small farm loans, programs for mothers starting over. The bureaucracy used to feel like a wall. Now it felt like a map. I wasn't looking for a handout. I was looking for a partner. I was a landowner now. I had something to offer. The work was slow and heavy. The first few weeks were a blur of bleach and grit. I scrubbed away years of dust. I ripped the rot out of the porch floorboards. I hired Jeb, the roofer Earl recommended. He showed up with his 2 sons. They fixed the leaks in 3 days for a fair price. When he was done, he shook my hand like I belonged there. People in town began to notice. The woman at the general store saved day-old bread for me. Earl stopped charging me for every trip. They were watching. The community Eleanor kept at a distance was finally opening a door for me. They respected her independence. Now, they were starting to respect mine. A few months later, I sat on the repaired porch. I watched the sunset paint the mountains in purple and gold. The house was clean. The power was humming. The water ran clear. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Leo was chasing fireflies in the yard. His laughter felt like music in the quiet air. My phone rang. It was Mr. Davies. The cold, professional distance was gone from his voice. He said. I looked at my son and smiled. I said. Davies said over the line. My heart gave a heavy thud. They weren't walking away. No, he replied, but the game has changed. They weren't making another offer to buy me out. Instead, they wanted to discuss a conservation easement for the back half of the property, the part bordering the state forest. I knew the term from my hours spent at the library. I would sell the development rights. The land could never be touched by a bulldozer, but the title would stay in my name. It would be protected for eternity. Underscore, quote, underscore, Davies explained. Underscore, quote, underscore 81. Underscore. A laugh started deep in my chest. It was a jagged, joyful sound. The irony was perfect. Eleanor Vance had held them off for 30 years. Now they had to pay me to help them protect the very earth they tried to steal. Underscore, quote, underscore 82. Underscore, Davies asked. He wasn't giving me advice anymore. He was waiting for my command. I looked toward the dark silhouettes of the pines where my land met the forest. I thought of my grandmother's fierce, protective eyes in that old photograph. She wasn't just holding onto a house. She was guarding the creek, the shadows, every wild thing that breathed out there. Quote, 83, I said, letting the words settle. Quote, 84. This story isn't about an inheritance of dirt or dollars. It's about a legacy of truth. It's about realizing the story you were told about your life was only a fragment. Sometimes, what feels like abandonment is actually a radical act of protection. Sometimes, the people we think are broken are the ones holding the world together. Eleanor left me a crumbling shack and $2. But she also left me a choice, a foundation, a new narrative. I am no longer a victim of my past. I am the architect of my own future. This future is built on ground paid for with a lifetime of lonely, stubborn love. It's a truth I relearn every morning as I watch Leo under this wide-open sky. Home isn't a gift you are handed. It's a place you claim, a place you fight for, a place you build with your own 2 hands. Sometimes you have to demolish the old stories to find the foundation underneath. If this has touched a nerve in you, if it made you think of your own ghosts, I'd be honored to hear your story. Tell me what the word home means to you in the comments. Your experiences matter here. This channel is a place for those of us who had to build ourselves from scratch. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe if you haven't yet. There are so many more stories to tell.